Okay, welcome. We are coming to you today from the Alcohol House, which is the collection of all of the amphibians and reptiles. I am Sheridan. I'm the curator of amphibians and reptiles here at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, and I'm going to be talking to you today about my upcoming trip to Borneo. So I'm going into the field next week, and I wanted to share a little bit about that trip with you. So first, let me ask you, where is Borneo? Well, Borneo is the third largest island in the world, and it sits in the middle of the South China Sea. And I think we have a graphic of that so you can see where that is. And usually when I go to Borneo, it's for research. So I study frogs, and so where am I likely to find these frogs that I'm studying? Well, let's think about where frogs live. So, in other words, if I'm in the jungle, where exactly am I finding these frogs that I'm trying to study? Well, you might know that frogs have permeable skin, and that means that if they sit in water, they will absorb some of that water through their skin. Now, our bodies don't do that because our skin is waterproof, but frogs have nice permeable skin, and because they can absorb some water into their skin, that also means that they can lose water through their skin, which means that they have to stay in very moist environments. So they generally stay pretty close to water. Okay, so if we know that they're going to stay pretty close to water, then let's think about where we might find them. So Borneo obviously has a big coastline because it's an island. So are we going to find them near that coastline? Well, that water is salty along the coastline, and most frogs can't tolerate salt water. So they tend to stay near freshwater bodies. So they tend to stay near things like ponds and lakes and rivers and streams. So in Borneo, because it's very hilly and mountainous, are we likely to find areas with flat bodies of water like ponds or lakes? No, we're going to find rivers and streams. So in Borneo, I get to go out into the jungle at night and walk along these streams, and I count every frog that I find. And then during the day, I search those same streams for tadpoles or frog larvae. So on this particular trip coming up, I'm going as part of a class, and I'll be teaching graduate students or people who've already finished college and are doing a master's or a PhD. I'll be teaching them several different ways to survey frogs, and those students will then conduct research projects, and hopefully some of them will choose to work on frogs for those research projects. And in between that teaching and helping out with those students, then I'll also get to collect some data for my own long-term research projects. So, how do we do this? So how do scientists exactly study frogs? What does it look like? What does it mean day to day when I'm out in the field? Well, there's lots of different ways people do this, and I'm going to talk to you about the three main ways that I personally use when I'm studying frogs. So the first way, the three ways that I'm going to talk to you about are visual encounter surveys, call recording, and radio tracking. So visual encounter surveys, as you can guess, means essentially going out and looking for frogs or visually encountering frogs. Now, because frogs are small and they often hide under leaves or underground during the day to avoid drying out and to avoid predators, we usually tend to find them at night. It's a little bit cooler at night, so they don't run as high of a risk of drying out. There's fewer predators, and it's easier to find frogs at night when we study them. And when we're out at night, what we're looking for is something called eye shine. So frogs are nocturnal, which means they're active at night, and all nocturnal animals have eyes that are different from our own. They tend to be very big eyes that let lots of light in so that they can see in what our eyes perceive as very dark environments. And because of the way that their eyes are structured to let a lot of that light in, their eyes actually also reflect that light back out to a light source. So for example, if you were to take a flashlight and shine it at a nocturnal animal, you would see that light reflecting back at you. Now, we don't use flashlights as herpetologists or people who study frogs because we need our hands free to catch those frogs or to write down our data. So we basically put our flashlights on our heads in what is called a headlamp. So I use this one. We put our headlamps on our head. I'm not going to turn it on because I don't want to blind you, but we'll turn on our headlamps, and then this allows us to look around, and whenever we see eye shine of a frog, then we can go grab it and we can write down all the information that we need about that frog. So we go out to these streams, we look for the reflective eye shine, and I have for my work what's called a transect. And in my case, this is a length of a given stream that I have marked with flagging tape. So flagging tape looks like this, and I tie this on branches or around the trunk of a tree, whatever's available. I tie this every 10 meters so that when I'm along that long stream, I know exactly where I am. And I survey those same areas over and over again so I can get a sense of where the frogs are sitting. Do they like to sit around specific sections of the stream? Are they moving around the whole stream? What's happening with those individual frogs? So, in addition, all scientists have to record their data, and this is what my data book looks like. So this, because I work in the rainforest, is waterproof paper so that I can write on it and it won't get smudged. I always use a pencil because pens don't tend to be waterproof, but pencils are. So we write in pencil and we write down everything that we want to know about our study organisms. So in my case, I write down the time, where I am, the name of the species, whether it's male or female, and then several bits of information about where the frog is sitting, so that again, we can get a sense of which species like to sit on what kind of substrates or surfaces, and whether they have a preference for different kinds of water. Do they like fast water? Do they prefer slow water? So we record all of that in here. Okay. So I mentioned that we also record whether it's a male or female. So let me ask you, how do you tell a boy frog from a girl frog? Well, the answer is that it depends on the species. So in many species, the female is bigger. And why is that? So raise your hand if you know. Okay, it's because females carry eggs. So they have to be bigger to have that space for those eggs. But that's not always the case. So in some species, there isn't that difference. In some species, there's an overlap in the size of males and females. So then what do you do? Well, in some species, males have what are called nuptial pads. And this is an enlargement on the inside of the thumb, and I think we have a picture of several examples of that. And what that does is it's a way for the male to help stimulate the female to lay her eggs. So when frogs mate, what happens is if you have a female, the male will sit basically on her back, and he wraps his arms around her, either under her arms or around her waist. And those nuptial pads that they have on the inside of their thumb help to stimulate her to lay her eggs so that he can fertilize them. Okay, and I also mentioned that we measure our frogs, so we want to know how big these frogs are. So how do we do that? Well, if we were in the lab, we would use something like this, which is called calipers. So we use this, and let's say we had a frog about this big, then we take these calipers and we measure what's called the snout vent length. So the snout down to the bottom of their torso, or their vent. But the calipers aren't really very good in the field because we want to be moving quickly to make sure we're getting everything. So we usually use a simple ruler like this. So I take that frog that I've got, I lay the ruler along his back, and then I can tell that my frog, in this case, or my thumb, is 55 millimeters. And we write that down. Okay, so we use our headlamps, we find eye shine along these streams, along these transects for visual encounter surveys, and we record the name of the species, the sex, the size, and all of the important information about the environment that we're finding them in. And another way that we can get important information about frogs that I often use is called call recording. So raise your hand if you've ever heard a frog call. Okay, and does anyone know why frogs call? Well, first let me ask you this. Raise your hand if you think males call. And raise your hand if you think females call. And raise your hand if you think it's both. Okay, so in some cases, frogs will have vocalizations that are essentially alarm calls. Like, for example, if they get grabbed by a human who's trying to study them. And in that case, both the males and the females will make those alarm calls. But the majority of calls that you're hearing, if you ever hear frogs calling, are actually the males. And that's because males need to do two things. One, they sometimes need to tell other males that a given area is theirs. It's sort of like saying to your brother or sister, get out of my room. But the most important reason that frogs call is to find a mate. So males are calling to let females know that they're there, and then the females, because their ears are so well tuned to those calls, can actually tell the size of the frog that is calling. And this allows her to choose the biggest male to mate with so that she has large, healthy offspring. The other cool thing about frog calls is that they are what scientists call a reproductively isolating mechanism, which means that it prevents two individuals that are not the same species from mating together. So it separates different species. And females can tell then whether a call that they hear is from an individual of their same species or from a different species. So even though you and I might hear calls and we're not really sure if it's the same, the inner ear of those females is so well tuned to the calls of their own species that they know immediately whether they're hearing a male of their same species. So if you imagine a pond environment, for example, where there's lots of different species and therefore lots of males calling, it can get really loud in the summer. And so females then have to have ways to quickly determine where to go to find those mates. And the way that their inner ears are tuned to the calls of their conspecifics, the males of their own species, helps them to immediately and quickly find the optimal mate. Okay, so because of that, because these females can tell those calls so well, this actually allows scientists to utilize those calls to differentiate species. So I can go out and use my trusty microphone and my call recorder, looks like this, and record calls of those species, and then I put it into software that allows me to examine some elements of the call, like frequency and amplitude, to determine whether calls of two different individuals are actually the same species or whether they're different species. So call recording helps us to distinguish species that outwardly look very similar. Okay, and the last survey method I'm going to talk to you about is called radio tracking. And as you can probably guess, it involves using radio waves to track frogs. So, how does this work? Well, you have to have what's called a transmitter. The transmitter is what emits the radio waves, or the signal. Now, if you watch National Geographic or Animal Planet, you may have seen animals with maybe a big collar around their neck. That's a radio collar. And those are ways that scientists that study big animals can track those organisms. Now, those radio collars that you see on large animals are very big and heavy because those things like elephants and lions can support that big, heavy radio collar. But frogs are really light, and you want to be sure that whatever you attach to an animal isn't going to negatively impact their movements or their behavior or activities. So scientists try to keep those trackers to less than 10% of the body weight of the animal that they're attaching those to. So let's think about this. Who knows? Raise your hand if you know how much a frog weighs. Okay, well, the answer is that it depends on the species. The heaviest frog is the Goliath frog, and I think we have a picture of this. So the Goliath frog lives in Africa, and it weighs between 3 and 4 kilograms, or about 7 pounds. That's the size of a baby. So these are really big frogs. The lightest frog at the other end of the scale is a frog from Papua New Guinea, or a small island just north of Australia, and it's smaller than the size of a dime, and I think we have a picture of that too. Now those guys are less than 10 millimeters, so if I were to show you on my ruler from the end of the ruler less than this distance. So they're really tiny, again, smaller than a dime. And those individuals weigh less than a fraction of a gram. So really, really small and light. Probably not possible to attach a radio transmitter to. So the smallest radio transmitter that you can get that's going to last more than a couple of days is about half a gram. So you need a frog that's maybe about this big, or about 45 millimeters, to track. And in my study streams in Borneo, we have lots of frogs to choose from. So what we do is we attach a transmitter like this, and I think we have a picture of what this looks like when it's on the frog. But this basically is the transmitter. This is emitting a signal. I've got a little piece of plastic that's stretchy, and this allows me to tie it basically around their waist as kind of like a bum bag or a belt. And then this is the antenna, and this antenna helps me pick up that signal. So I take a separate antenna and I go out into the forest and I look for that signal. And when this is activated, it makes a beep, beep, beep. And the closer you get to it, the louder it is. So I take my little antenna, I've got my receiver, and I go around the forest looking for all of the frogs that I have tagged. So, let's see. Okay, so why do we do all of this? Why do scientists go into the jungles to find frogs? Why do we care how many species there are, or how many individuals there are, or what their calls sound like, or why they're moving, or how they're moving through their environment? Well, part of it, like all of science, is just to understand life on Earth. So much of science is the pursuit of understanding or knowledge. We want to know what's here on Earth with us and to understand it as best as we can. And for me in my work specifically, I'm interested in understanding a few different things. So one, I'm really interested in diversity of frogs in the tropics. And that means knowing how many species are out there. And to do that, you have to go out and physically find them. And for me, this is really interesting and important because I've always been fascinated with diversity of life in the tropics. As a little kid, I just loved the idea of rainforests. I would see these programs on TV, and I just couldn't believe that there were that many species because I grew up in Detroit, and in my backyard, I did not see that many species. And I could not believe that there were that many species somewhere out there in the world. And I've always wanted to work in rainforests. And I can tell you that it's even more amazing than I thought it would be when I was a kid. So I do this because I've always been interested in animals and life on Earth and this diversity in the tropics. And so in order to understand life on Earth, again, we have to know how many species there are, which means that we have to go out and find them and record their calls and identify them to species. I'm also interested in conserving or preserving that biodiversity. So I think everybody probably knows that a lot of the rainforest is being cut down. And when you cut down that forest, you're going to lose space for species to live. And eventually what that means is that you will lose those species that live there. So you may not care personally whether you lose a species of frog in a country you've never been to or a country maybe you've never even heard of. But the important reason that we should care about things like that is because when we lose species, then the environment doesn't function the same way that it has in the past. So things like nutrient cycling or water cycling, those processes get disrupted when we lose species. And then we run the risk of altering the environment, not just by deforesting it, but by altering those processes in the parts of forests that we have left. So that can be really challenging to predict how those processes are going to be altered by losing species. And so the more information we have about how organisms interact with their environment, what species there are, and how they're utilizing that landscape when it's altered, that allows us to make better predictions about how those processes are going to be altered by deforestation so that we can make more informed decisions about how to utilize the landscapes that we live in. Okay, so if you have questions about frogs, about what it's like living in the jungle, about what we eat in the field, about how you say things in Malay, like frog, or any colors, or anything else that you can think of, I would love to answer your questions. So please submit your questions along with your school so I can give you a shout out. And also follow along in the coming weeks. So I'll be blogging and posting videos and tweets from the field. And again, if you send in questions in the coming weeks, I'll be more than happy to answer as many of them as I can. So please write in. All right, so we have our first question. So first, somebody asks, how do you capture frogs in Borneo to study? So this is a good question. So whenever I take someone out into the field for the first time, I have to show them this. So frogs generally are either on the ground or on a leaf. Now let's pretend that this is a frog that's sitting either on the ground or on a leaf. Now if the frog's head is here, you know, sorry, I don't know if you can say this, you know that the frog is probably going to jump when it gets spooked. So you kind of want to make sure you're coming at it from the front. So you're gonna cup your hand a little bit. One mistake often newbies make is they leave a little hole here and the frog goes out this way. So you always want to close your thumb to your hand like this, and then you just firmly but carefully put your hand on top of that frog. Now this little space here is nice because then usually you can get the frog to kind of jump into your fingers, and then you got it. And then from there, you take it out of your hand and you can hold it. I like to pinch them around the waist because there's no vital organs, so you can hold on to them pretty firmly. And then you can measure them and look at their nuptial pads and look to see if they have eggs, if they're females. So that's generally how we do it. Basically, you just go and you grab them gently. Okay, another person asked, do you study any poisonous frogs? And the answer is yes. So a lot of people know poisonous frogs from Central and South America, these bright frogs that are called poison dart frogs. Well, in Southeast Asia, we have some that are also poisonous. They're not quite as poisonous as the poison dart frogs in Central and South America, but if you have a cut on your hand, for example, and you were to grab that frog, it would sting a little bit. So it's not so poisonous that you can't touch them at all, but you wouldn't want to put it into your mouth, for example. And then somebody also asks, this is really great, how old do frogs get, or what is the oldest frog? I actually don't know what is the oldest recorded frog, and this is really hard to study with frogs. People have studied this with animals in captivity. I don't know the answer for captive frogs either, but I know that in the wild, it's really hard to follow frogs from one year to the next, which means that it's really hard to determine how old frogs are. A lot of scientists have ideas or thoughts on how old a frog is based on its size. So presumably the bigger it is, the older it is. So frogs have what is called indeterminate growth, meaning they continue growing throughout their lives. And based on the size of the individuals that we're seeing, then you can guesstimate how old these frogs are. I think in Borneo, where I work, most of the frogs are probably a couple of years old. And then some of the big species, there's one species that gets about this long, not including its legs. And those species probably are 5 or more years old, but it's really tough to tell. So that's a really good question. And if anyone has ideas about how to tell a frog's age, you should become a herpetologist. All right, we got some more questions. Somebody asked, how are frogs different from toads? Excellent question. So frogs is a term that we use for the tailless, four-limbed amphibians. So anything that you think of as a frog or a toad, we call frogs. Toads are specifically one type of frog, not like a single individual or species, but a group within the larger grouping of frogs. Toads tend to have drier skin. They tend to have some different features than many other frogs, but there's a lot of variability both within non-toad frogs and within toads, so that it's there's a lot of overlap in their features. But generally, we tend to see that toads have what appears to be more dry-looking skin outwardly. Somebody asked, why Borneo? That is a really good question. So When I was in college, I took an ecology class, and the TA for that class was a graduate student, and she had a project studying amphibians in the forest preserves around Chicago. So I worked with her the summer between my third and fourth year of college, and then as I was graduating the next year, she was getting ready to start her field work in Borneo. So her dissertation research was in Borneo, and I was interested in going to graduate school, but I didn't know where I was going to be going yet, and I wanted some more research experience. So she hired me to help her with her dissertation research in Borneo, and it was even more amazing than I thought it would be, and it was the greatest 6 months of my life up to that point. I had no idea where Malaysia was on a map before I went there. I couldn't speak a word of Malay when I landed, and I didn't know anything about frogs in the rainforest. And I woke up every day practically jumping up out of bed, getting ready to go out into the field. I absolutely loved it. And because there's so many frogs on Borneo, it makes it a really nice study system for answering ecological and evolutionary questions. So when you're a scientist, you're always trying to get a big sample size, meaning survey lots of individuals. And because there's so many frogs in Borneo, it's a really nice system to work in. So that's why I keep working in Borneo. And that sort of, I guess, answers this other question, which somebody said, what first got you interested in studying frogs? And it was that TA and that experience of helping her with her research in those forest preserves around Chicago. So I remember going into college liking biology, but I thought that if you liked biology, the only thing you could do for a living was be a doctor. So I assumed I would go to medical school. And in my third year in college, I think it was, I took an animal behavior class. And that just opened my eyes to other possibilities when I knew that I liked biology, but I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do or be. So I took animal behavior, and then I took this ecology class, and I remember going out into those ponds with her around Chicago, and I had these waders on, and I was like thigh deep in this water, and we had set these minnow traps. And I remember opening these traps, and it was just full of these blue-spotted salamanders and these giant tadpoles. And I remember thinking, I can't believe I'm getting paid to play with animals, basically. And that was it for me. And I just knew that I wanted to do something like that. So that's really what got me into it. Okay. Somebody asks, are there poisonous frogs in the US? That is an excellent question. I don't know if I know the answer to that. I will have to get back to you on that one. I cannot think of one. It is possible that actually no, I take that back. I always forget about toads. So all toads are poisonous. So you may see on toads, they have what are called parotid glands. So this big kind of enlargement behind their eye, kind of along the top of their neck. And then all the little warts that they have on their body, those all can exude toxin. And so when a toad is disturbed, it often kind of secretes a substance. Sometimes it's white or milky, other times it's just clear, but anytime you disturb a toad, it will emit that toxic substance. So yes, there are poison frogs, but not kind of like the colorful ones you might be thinking of from Central America. Somebody else asked, how many frogs have you tagged? So using my radio transmitters, a very small number actually. So in 2016, my team and I tagged 8 individuals. Now, part of the reason that number is so small is because it can take a long time to find them each day. And you want to make sure that you are finding them every day, because you have to make sure that they are not being hindered by that belt. So if that belt starts to rub them or irritate their skin, you have to remove it. And that means you have to go out and find them every day. Now the time to find the individual can vary. Sometimes it's only a few minutes if they haven't moved from where you last found them, up to well over an hour, maybe even 2. And so you tag a very small number of individuals at any one time so that you can make sure that they're not being negatively impacted by that tag. But that being said, I'm going to Borneo next week and I have radio transmitters being delivered to Borneo. So I'm looking forward to working together with the students to tag hopefully anywhere from 5 to 15 more individuals and tracking them. So I'll get back to you on what we're finding there. And then somebody asked, how do you say frog in Malay? This is a good one. So the word for frog in Malay is katak, and the word for toad is kodok. And I love this one. The word for tadpole is borudu, and that's a really fun one to say. So yeah. All right, I think that is all we have time for. Thank you very much for tuning in. Like I said, please do tune in the coming weeks. Follow along. I'll be blogging and posting videos and tweets. Again, send in any more questions you have. If there's something you want me to post a video about or a question you want me to answer, I'll be more than happy to get to it in the coming weeks, and I'll take you along on this fun adventure. All right, thank you very much.